Why is the person who tries the least always the one who attracts the most? Think about it for a moment. You almost certainly have someone like that in mind. Someone who does nothing extraordinary, who doesn't chase, who doesn't send messages at midnight with their heart on their sleeve, who doesn't rearrange their schedule to be available, and yet generates an attraction that seems to come from another dimension. And then there's the other type, the one who does everything they're supposed to do, the one who's present, who listens, who shows up when needed, who makes their interest clear and consistent. And yet, the closer they get, the further away the person they care about drifts. If this feels familiar, if you've ever experienced that particular injustice of watching effort not only fail but actually make things worse, then what you're about to hear will shake you in ways you don't expect. Because the explanation isn't where most people look for it. It's not on the surface. It lies in something that happens in the human brain at such a primitive level, so far beneath any conscious reasoning, that even the person experiencing it doesn't know exactly why it's happening. And the answer has been written down for centuries, not in any modern psychology book. In the texts of a man who lived in Florence in the 16th century, who never spoke of love or seduction, and who nonetheless described the exact mechanism with a clarity that still feels disturbing today. There's an experiment I want you to know about. In 1966, psychologists Elliot Aronson and Darwin Linder designed a study that was later named the gain-loss effect. They divided participants into groups and exposed them to different sequences of evaluations from other people. One group always received positive comments about themselves. Another always received negative ones. A third group started with negative comments that gradually became positive. And the fourth began with praise that over time turned into criticism. The result was so counterintuitive that the researchers themselves were slow to accept it. The people who generated the most attraction were not those who had always been positive. They were the ones who had started out as difficult and gradually opened up. The human brain does not value what it has always had. It values what it perceives it has earned. This is not romantic theory. It is pure neuroscience. The brain's reward system, the circuit that releases dopamine and generates the feeling of satisfaction and desire, does not activate when something arrives without resistance. It activates in anticipation, in the process of obtaining something that was never guaranteed from the start. Dopamine is not the hormone of pleasure already achieved. It is the hormone of pleasure on its way. And here is where Machiavelli enters. Because what that study described in a laboratory in the 20th century, Machiavelli had articulated politically 400 years earlier, with a precision that runs cold. He wrote that men value more highly what they have had to struggle for than what was handed to them without cost. That the prince who concedes too quickly, who opens the doors before anyone has even knocked, unknowingly destroys the perception of his own worth. He was not talking about relationships. He was talking about power. But power and desire, when you examine them through the lens of psychology, obey exactly the same logic. Now let me take you to a concept that very few people mention but that changes absolutely everything once you truly understand it. It is called psychological reactance. It was described by psychologist Jack Brem in 1966, the same year as Aronson's experiment, as though that year had something special about it, a year for revealing uncomfortable truths about human desire. Reactance is the mechanism by which the brain responds to the perception that its freedom is being restricted. When we sense that something is being imposed on us, that an option is being removed, that a door is closing, the brain automatically generates an impulse toward exactly what it perceives as threatened, not because it wants it more in rational terms, but because the possibility of loss triggers an alarm that says, "Move before it's too late." This explains something that seems almost inexplicable when you observe it from the outside. Why people suddenly become far more interesting the moment they start to pull away. Why a conversation that had been lukewarm for weeks suddenly ignites something when one of the two stops insisting. Why the unexpected silence of someone who was always available generates more unease than months of constant presence. It's not a game. It's not a calculated tactic in most cases. It is reactance operating in a completely automatic way. The other person's brain registers the change, detects that something previously guaranteed is no longer so, and fires the alarm mechanism that Brem described with such precision. And here comes the point that is most uncomfortable. when you are always present, when there is no possibility of you disappearing, when your availability is total and predictable, you are permanently disabling that mechanism, not through malice, not through strategic error. Simply because reactance has nothing to operate on, there is no door that can close because it is always wide open. Machiavelli had a way of describing this that is brutal in its honesty. He said that men grow accustomed to benefits they receive continuously and stop valuing them, but that a single good that is taken away becomes intolerable. In other words, what was always there disappears without grief. What is suddenly missing hurts in a disproportionate way. Think about water. You have had access to clean water your entire life, and you probably never think about it. You don't value it. You don't consciously feel grateful for it. But the day you turn on the tap and nothing comes out, something inside you reacts with an urgency you didn't expect. Not because the water has increased in objective value, but because the possibility of not having it has activated something that abundance was keeping dormant. Now let's translate that into the dynamics of interpersonal desire and observe what happens. The human brain has a fascinating tendency that evolutionary psychologists have studied for decades. It evaluates the social value of others in relative, not absolute terms. It doesn't ask whether someone is valuable in universal terms. It asks whether that person is more or less accessible than would be expected given their perceived level of value. And when there is a gap between perceived value and accessibility, the brain reads it as a signal. When someone who appears to have a great deal to offer presents themselves as completely accessible from the very first moment, the brain doesn't read it as generosity. It reads it as a contradiction. And faced with that contradiction, it does what it always does, with inconsistent information. It revises the perceived value downward so that it aligns with the observed accessibility. This is devastating when you think about it in practical terms. It means that the more you give without it having been earned, the more available you are without that availability having cost anyone anything. The more you are actively working against how you are perceived, not because you are less valuable, but because the other person's brain is recalculating your value based on the signal you are sending. And now comes something I want to stay with you, because it is the core of everything we are building here. There is a radical difference between two types of presence: the presence that comes from need and the presence that comes from choice. And although from the outside they can look identical, the brain of the person receiving them distinguishes between them with a precision that seems almost supernatural. When you are present because you need to be present, because your absence would generate an anxiety you don't know how to manage, because your emotional well-being depends on that interaction, that need filters through. Not always in what you say, often in how you say it, in the speed of your responses, in the texture of your words when the other person takes a while to reply, in how you handle an unexpected silence, in whether you are capable of putting down your phone and not picking it up again for hours without it costing you a disproportionate effort. Need has a frequency, and the human brain, trained over hundreds of thousands of years to detect subtle social signals, picks it up. On the other hand, when you are present because you have chosen to be, when your life would work just as well if that conversation didn't exist, when your presence is a gift you decide to give rather than a need you have to satisfy, that also has a frequency, and that frequency communicates something entirely different. Machiavelli articulated this in a way that in his context sounded like pure hard politics, but which in this domain has a very direct application. He said that the wise prince should never act out of fear when he has an alternative, because action born of fear always sacrifices the strategic for the immediate, and that sacrifice, though invisible in the moment, collects its debt with interest. Replace prince with person. Replace fear with need for approval. And you have exactly what we are discussing. Now I want to talk to you about something called the emotional mirror effect, which connects everything we have seen so far with something you have probably felt but never been able to name. When we interact with other people, especially in contexts of attraction or romantic interest, there is a process of emotional calibration that takes place continuously and automatically. Each person's brain reads the emotional state of the other and adjusts its own responses based on what it detects. If what it detects is urgency, its own system goes on guard. If what it detects is calm, its system relaxes. If what it detects is scarcity, its system activates the valuation mechanism. If what it detects is unlimited abundance, that mechanism shuts off. This means something that very few people explain clearly. Your internal state is not a private matter that only affects your subjective experience. Your internal state is information that the other person receives, processes, and reacts to, even when neither of you is conscious of the process. Research in the field of nonverbal communication estimates that more than 60% of the emotional information we transmit in an interaction arrives through channels we do not consciously control. The micro-expression that lasts a fraction of a second, the tone that shifts slightly when you are anxious, the way your writing pace changes depending on your emotional state, the coherence or inconsistency between what you say and how you say it. You cannot directly control those channels, but you can work on what generates them. And what generates them is your real internal state, not the image you are trying to project. Here is the trap that most people fall into when they try to apply principles of attraction superficially. They focus on visible behaviors, on waiting a certain amount of time before replying, on not always being the one to suggest plans, on appearing busy. But if those behaviors don't correspond to a genuine internal state, if they are a performance that requires effort and that contradicts what you actually feel, the other person's brain detects it. It can't identify exactly what doesn't fit, but it notices that something doesn't add up. And that dissonance, that vague sense that the image doesn't match the reality, is one of the most powerful inhibitors of desire that exists. Machiavelli had a phrase for this too, and it is perhaps the most relevant one in all of his work when applied to this domain. He wrote that the one who deceives will always find someone willing to be deceived, but that even the most well-crafted fictions have a natural limit: time. Reality, he said, always ends up imposing itself, and the power born from fiction falls with it. Applied to what we are discussing, you can sustain an appearance for a time, but the person who gets close enough, who interacts with you in enough different contexts, who observes you when your guard is down, will find either the coherence or its absence. And that coherence between what you project and what you are is what determines whether the attraction deepens or evaporates. Because there is something that surface tactics can never produce: the feeling that what you are seeing is real, that the person in front of you is genuinely like this and is not playing a role. And that sense of authenticity, when it arrives, is irresistibly attractive, precisely because it is extraordinarily rare. Most people interact from behind masks, from curated versions of themselves, from what they believe the other person wants to see. And that produces interactions that work at a certain level but have a very low ceiling, because they are built on a foundation that both parties, even if they never say it out loud, know is not entirely solid. The man who needs no mask, who can be who he is without adjusting it based on what he perceives is expected of him, who has enough internal solidity to show up as himself and trust that it is enough, that man projects something that the brains of those around him register as extraordinarily uncommon. And what is scarce, as we saw at the beginning, automatically activates the valuation mechanism. Let me now go to something that carries enormous psychological weight, and that is almost never addressed with the honesty it deserves: the role of self-concept in the dynamics of attraction. Self-concept is the image you hold of yourself, not the image you project, but the one you carry internally and privately when no one is watching. And there is a direct connection, documented across decades of research in social psychology, between self-concept and the type of relationships you attract and remain in. People with a solid and positive self-concept have a natural tendency to enter relationships from a place of sufficiency. They don't need the other person to tell them they are worthy in order to believe it. They don't look to external approval to confirm what they already know internally. And that sufficiency, that visible absence of need, radically changes the dynamic of any interaction. People with a fragile or inconsistent self-concept, on the other hand, tend to seek in relationships what they cannot give themselves. They need the message that arrives, the validation that confirms, the signal that says, yes, you are there, you matter. And that search, though completely human and understandable, produces exactly the anxious availability that inhibits attraction. It is not a moral flaw. It is not a character weakness. It is a direct consequence of a self-concept that does not yet have enough solidity to function autonomously. And the only way to build that solidity is not by learning to appear as though you have it. It is by actually building it. This, once again, connects with Machiavelli in a way that feels almost elegant. He wrote something that in his context referred to states, but that in psychological terms is devastatingly precise. That strength, which depends on external factors, is always precarious, because those factors can change. The only truly stable strength is the one born from one's own resources. Your self-concept is those resources. And as long as it depends on external validation to remain standing, you will live with the fragility of someone who builds their house on ground they do not control. Now comes the moment when I want you to ask yourself a question you may have been avoiding until now. What happens exactly inside you when someone you're interested in takes a long time to reply? What goes on during those hours, sometimes those days, of uncertainty? What narrative do you construct? What interpretations emerge? What conclusions does your mind reach before any real information has arrived? Observe that internal response honestly, because coded within it is most of what you need to understand about how you are relating to others and why the results don't always match what you expect. If what happens during those hours is a spiral of negative interpretations, if your brain constructs scenarios of loss and rejection with a speed that surprises even you, if the discomfort is so intense that the impulse to do something to resolve it becomes almost irresistible, then what you are experiencing is called intolerance of uncertainty, and it is one of the most studied psychological patterns in the field of interpersonal anxiety. Intolerance of uncertainty is not just unpleasant, it produces behaviors that systematically sabotage what you are trying to build, because the brain, when it cannot tolerate uncertainty, seeks to resolve it by whatever means is most immediately available. And resolving uncertainty quickly in the context of relationships almost always means doing something, saying something, seeking the reassuring signal that confirms everything is fine, that you still matter, that the connection hasn't disappeared, and that something you do to soothe your own nervous system is exactly what the other person perceives as need, as urgency, as the signal that you are an abundant resource that requires no effort whatsoever to access, the capacity to sit with uncertainty, to let things unfold without needing to control the pace, to trust that your life continues to have meaning and direction even when a particular conversation remains unresolved for a while. That capacity is perhaps the psychological skill most directly related to the quality of your interpersonal relationships, and it is built, not all at once, not in a straight line, but it is built. Machiavelli spoke of fortune as a river that can overflow, but against which the prudent man builds embankments. Not to control the river, which is impossible, but so that when it floods, the damage is lesser. Uncertainty is that river. You cannot control when it arrives or with what intensity, but you can work on the solidity of what you build around it so that it doesn't sweep you away every time it appears. And now I want to leave you with something that is possibly the most counterintuitive thing we have covered today, and also the most liberating if you genuinely manage to internalize it. Genuine attraction, the kind that requires no constant maintenance, no feeding with new tactics, the kind that grows over time rather than wearing away, does not come from what you do to generate it. It comes from what you stop seeking. When you stop seeking the approval of others as a source of information about your own worth, something shifts in the way you move through the world. You stop calibrating every response based on how you think it will be received. You stop adjusting what you say in order to fit the image you perceive the other person wants to see. You stop reading every signal as a verdict on whether you are enough or not. And that release, that letting go of the need for approval, paradoxically produces what years of seeking it never managed to produce. Because people, when they sense that someone doesn't need their validation to be okay, that their world doesn't revolve around what they think of them, feel something that very few things generate with such consistency: respect. And respect, in the domain of relationships, is the soil on which everything else grows. Machiavelli closed The Prince with a reflection that in its context was a political call to arms, but which, read from here, carries a different weight. He said that the time to act is always now, because opportunity does not wait for us to be ready, and that the man who waits for perfect conditions to begin never begins at all. Building who you are, the solidity of your self-concept, the capacity to tolerate uncertainty, the life you have when no one is watching. None of that begins when you find the right person. It begins now. And every day you invest in it, every time you choose your own standard over the need for approval, every time you sit with the discomfort instead of running from it, you are building something no tactic can ever replace. I am not telling you to ignore the people who matter to you. I am not telling you to become cold or to build walls. I am telling you that the version of you that truly attracts, the one that generates something lasting and real, already exists. It is just buried beneath years of looking outside for something that can only come from within. And that, however uncomfortable it may be to hear, is exactly the best news you could have received today. If you made it to the end of this video, comment, "I made it," and I will personally reply to you. And if this resonated with you, subscribe to be part of this, and hit like if you enjoyed it.